Materialism is a metaphysical thesis that all the substance within the universe purely consists of that of material and whatever cause exists to cause them. The explanations materialists give is clearly from the get-go restricted to their own acknowledgement of existing entities, i.e. material. However, it is within the realm of quantum mechanics which is thought to provide the very basis to all metaphysical reality that the materialist finds the most contention, and in fact I will attempt to present and solidify this theory's contentions of materialism. It stems all the way back to Einstein's paper attempting to find the flaws within this theory to justify materialism. It actually dissipates and crumbles under one's coherent views of material reality, and leads to the distinct realization that this view cannot be taken as a universal truth, an ultimate given, or even a correct approach to either physics or metaphysics. Before beginning with a full refutation, there is a few terms that may need to be clarified to avoid confusion and misconstruction of the argumentation applied. Quantum mechanics describes the motion of objects at the atomic and subatomic scales. Fundamental to quantum mechanics is the duality of its phenomena. Objects such as electrons and protons behave as either particles or waves depending on the experimental context. Similarly, radiation such as light exhibits both wave and particle behaviours. This is called S-duality. Quantum field theory is a description of these systems, generally consisting of a large amount of smaller components such as metal bullion consisting of a large atomic makeup. Relativistic quantum field theory is a combination to that of quantum field theory, quantum mechanics and special relativity in order to form one unified mathematical body as a tool for a full-fledged description that unifies quantum field theory and general relativity together as a theory of quantum gravity. Quantum cosmology is intended to aid the process to a discovery of a full-fledged description of quantum gravity, as to complete its own theory it requires a description for a full cosmological theory. Quantum entanglement is a signifier to the physical phenomena that occurs when two quantum systems come into close proximity and interact, thereby connecting these two systems through quantum spin, in which if one is observed in a certain way, the other spin will always be observable to the contrary of the other system's spin, meaning some communication between the systems must occur. Localizability is a phenomenon permeated from relativistic quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, in which states it is an impossibility to isolate a particle previously unobserved, i.e. narrow it down to a very specific spatial-temporal coordination. Now that these terms have been clarified, we can start drawing the connections, especially between the last 3 points. They will be absolutely crucial to an adequate understanding of the arguments that follow. Most notably, in connection to quantum entanglement, these non-local variables are very important. Under John Bell, an Irish mathematical physicist, he attempted to show the impossibility of quantum entanglement being characterized under local variables using something called the Bell's theorem. In this task he was successful. He demonstrated that these must be considered non-local variables, reflecting instantaneous transfer, and this was further solidified in empirical proof after experiments were conducted at the University of Paris in the 1980s by a physicist called Alan Aspect. He showed that the correct approach to these experiments is to use the parameters set out by quantum mechanics, as these would generate correct predictions rather than the traditional usage of the method assuming local variables and thus imposing material parameters. The existence of these variables alone dissipates the materialist worldview, and instead definitively proves the existence of a whole new form, at minimum, of metaphysical pluralistic dualism. The argument presented premise by premise can be summarised as follows. Premise 1. Materialism posits that all substance of reality is physical objects and whatever may supervene causally upon them. Premise 2. The materialist worldview is thus restricted in explanatory power to things they believe existent, i.e. material. Premise 3. Neither quantum entanglement nor quantum non-localizability can be explained under a material framework, and ergo the fundamental characteristic of reality, making up everything, cannot be explained under materialism. Premise 4. A true, absolute metaphysical theory must be able to explain every intuitive or explicitly stated contradiction to its nature. Premise 5. Materialism can offer no such explanation. The conclusion to these premises thus follows that materialism must be viewed as either a deficient metaphysical theory, or is to be outright rejected by its very basic premise, that it's distinctively in sharp contradiction to the real nature of things. The first two premises are largely uncontroversial. They are simply a definition and subsequent analytic logical deduction. The third and fourth premises, in which the arguments rest, will likely be the most contested, and thus we will turn our focus onto solidifying these premises. In order for anything to be under the classification of a material object, it is an absolute necessity that those objects possess distinctively defined and individual properties. One of such properties can be something like spatial-temporal properties, meaning that all material objects must to some capacity be localizable, and this is where it finds conflicts with quantum mechanics. The prescribed existence of objects under a microscopic reality are not actually present in the sense we'd prescribe them to be, rather they are a useful mathematical function in relation to pragmatic utility. If one is to presuppose that one distinct particle cannot serve as an infinite source of energy, and also that the same particle cannot be in two places at once, then the subsequent consequence of this is that measuring the particle bound to any spatial region is zero. And when special relativity is adapted into the equation, there can be no coherent justification as to the existence of microphysical material objects. We also have to take into consideration the non-localized nature of field quanta and that it fails a sufficient criteriation of material individuality. Thus, subsequently, the very fundamental causals of the material world are substance that simply cannot be explained or expressed as material, and since these are real conditions, there must be an explanation out with the material realm. The only way in which a materialist may try to avoid this is by using a concept developed by Hume. This posits that all irregularities to our own metaphysical theories regarding natural phenomena are not causally grounded. Rather, nature only prescribes laws in a purely undetermined and probabilistic manner, and thus is an ontological theory. It also takes the view that with and all supervened upon subjects comes an intrinsic quality of local properties. This prescribes a spatial-temporal model consistent with that of special relativity, and thus they claim that all these so-called irregularities are really just theorems presenting no flaws in the deductive process. However, this is an extremely flawed theory, and in the best case scenario is extremely improbable to be true. First, it would necessitate a locally material understood description of quantum outcomes, things that are not locally correlated. Thus, it is necessitating that we understand something in terms of something that doesn't exist within its substance, and will thus always lead to a false outcome. But to illustrate this in simpler terms, we can offer an analogy. Suppose there is two men in an office, both at the other side of the universe from one another, and assuming all world conditions are wholly equivalent through the whole process. Now suppose both of these men are writing an article for the same company, and by some chance, both men are writing the direct opposite of everything each other writes. Under this humane idea, there is no causally grounded explanation for this. According to the concept, these two men just have to somehow manage to do it with absolutely no communication, as it must always be locally coordinated. Clearly, this offers an extreme probability at best. And this analogy is not totally disanalogous, it reflects exactly what happens under the pretext of quantum spin, in which this concept that Hume takes must retain the exact same description. Clearly, this is only one argument among many that must be taken into consideration, but this does not mean that the materialist doesn't have to sufficiently address these critiques. I retain the position that the materialist has not sufficiently addressed these contradictions within the nature of quantum mechanics. However, if materialists were to offer a rejoinder to these points, I would be more than happy to converse. But to my understanding, this seems to provide a sort of justification for some sort of metaphysical phenomenalism, generally recognised by that of the Kantian distinction in metaphysics, between the phenomenal and nominal. Appearances are retained by that of sense experience, but not from the material world themselves, but rather from an ontology of the mental or the mind.